This day began like any other, but by the end, my world was upside down. I had just turned 60. Honestly, I hadn't expected anything special. Since Peter disappeared in 2006, my birthdays had become a quiet routine. My daughter, Grace, insisted on baking me a cake, bringing me flowers, or at least calling me with a cheerful voice, pretending everything was fine. And I played along, smiled, told her everything was okay, that time heals all wounds, that it didn't hurt anymore. White lies so she wouldn't be burdened with my demons. That day, it was raining lightly but steadily. One of those drizzles that make no sound but soak you to the bone. I was just about to make myself some tea when the doorbell rang. I looked at the clock. It was 3 p.m. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, there was no one there, just a medium-sized box wrapped in brown paper. There was no sender, no logo, no address, just my name. Megan, written in black script that I recognized immediately. This couldn't be. My heart gave a violent lurch. That handwriting was Peter's. There was no doubt. Every curve, every stroke, every slant was as if I were seeing him at the dining table with his coffee cup beside him and his half-lost gaze. My hands trembled. I slowly closed the door and placed the box on the table. I stared at it for several minutes without touching it. The ticking of the wall clock marked the seconds like hammer blows. Finally, I took a deep breath and opened the lid. Inside, there were only two things. An old photograph and a note folded 4 times. The photo of us. It was from 2005. We were laughing, wrapped in each other's arms on the beach. I was wearing the blue dress he always said made me look like the sea was envious. His hair was wind-tousled, and he was smiling. And in that moment, I believed his smile was genuine. This photo only existed in a frame on my nightstand. We had never digitized it, never shared it. Only he and I had a copy. How could it be here? With a pounding heart, I unfolded the note. The handwriting was the same. Simple, clear, without flourishes. It said, "I'm home." Nothing more. No greeting, no name, just that sentence. And that was enough to destabilize me. I dropped the paper, pressed my hands against my mouth, barely able to breathe. What did it mean? Was this a cruel joke? Was someone playing with me? Or was it really him? I jumped up. I felt an urgent need that I couldn't explain. I checked the door, locked it, and looked out the window. No one was on the street. I looked at the mailbox again. It was untouched, as if I hadn't just opened a door to a past I swore I had buried. I sat down and closed my eyes. Images of Peter flooded my mind, his voice telling me, "Megan, there's no storm I wouldn't face with you." His laughter, the way he'd tap my back when he passed behind me. But I also remembered the silence, the absence, the days I couldn't sleep, the anniversary he spent on a business trip and never explained why. The last time I saw him, he wore a white shirt and locked the door with a "be right back" that he never made good on. I opened my eyes and reread the message. "I'm home." It was an empty sentence or a coded message, and I had to decipher it. I called Diane, my best friend. I told her everything. She was silent for a few seconds, then said, "This can't be a coincidence. Megan, be careful. Should come over." I said no. I needed to be alone, but her voice, always steady, gave me a kind of anchor. I went into Peter's room. Well, what had once been our room. I had kept it locked for years, as if I could preserve his scent, his presence, if I didn't touch it. I slowly opened it. Everything was covered in dust. The bed was unterucht, the closet. I went to the desk, where his black notebook lay. I opened it. Last entry, March 2006. I can't take this anymore, but I have no choice. What couldn't he take? What choice didn't he have? I couldn't remember ever reading that. It had always been there. Suddenly, a draft made me look toward the hallway. The back window was open. I rushed to close it, but something on the floor caught my eye. It was a folded piece of paper, apparently blown there by the wind from a forgotten corner. I picked it up. It was an even older note in the same handwriting. "If one day I disappear, it's not because I left you, but because I had to start over." I sank to my knees, tears flowing unstoppably. What kind of farewell was this? Why hadn't he told me anything? I went back to the dining room, picked up the box, and turned it over. On the bottom, an address I didn't know was written in pencil, but with a terrifying detail. The word home was written next to it, as if he were inviting me or challenging me. In that moment, I made a decision I hadn't made in almost 2 decades. I would look for him, not for his sake, but for mine, for the woman I once was, for the woman I am now, because I was no longer afraid, because I deserved to know. But first, I had to search every corner of this house. Something told me that the message wasn't over, that this was just the beginning, that Peter had never entirely left. It's hard for me to remember the exact moment I fell in love with Peter. Maybe it was the way he looked at me when we first met at the library, when I was in my early 30s and he had just moved into the neighborhood. Maybe it was when he helped me carry a broken bag of oranges without a word, just with that natural calm that surrounded him. By the time I realized I was already in his world and he in mine, Peter was magnetic, not in that loud way some men are, but with a presence that filled the whole room. He spoke little, his voice was soft and deep, and when he laughed, which he often did back then, the air seemed to warm. He told me things that, at the time, seemed like eternal truths. I don't want to go through life alone. I found you, and I won't let you go. Things like that, soul-stirring sentences. In the early years, our life was like a perfect choreography. We had rituals. Every morning, he made coffee and placed it on my nightstand, even if I was still asleep. He loved reading the newspaper aloud, commenting on the news as if the world revolved around our breakfast. I listened, smiled, and responded with sentences that became ours. If the world burns, at least we'll watch it together. Sundays were sacred. We took walks in the park, bought croissants at the corner bakery, and sometimes when it rained, we stayed in bed for a long time watching old movies. He loved French thrillers, I loved Italian dramas. In the end, we watched all sorts of things, lying in each other's arms, enjoying the silence. Sometimes, his breath was enough to make me feel safe. When Grace was born, he dedicated himself to her wholeheartedly. He sang made-up songs to her, lifted her as if she were made of glass, and said things like, "This girl will be stronger than both of us combined." And I believed him, because Peter had a way of saying things that convinced you, even if they made no sense. He called me Megan, with a tenderness no one else could ever imitate. Our house was modest, but full of details that spoke of us. Books piled high by Grace, plants he diligently watered even though I always forgot them. Black and white photos hung with clothespins because we never got around to framing them. We even had a corner where we wrote letters to each other. A kind of game we invented. If someone had something difficult to say, they'd write it down, leave the letter on the desk, and the other would read it in silence. That was our way of not hurting each other with words said in the heat of the moment. Although for many years, these letters were only love notes, stolen poems, or small confessions like, "Today I dreamed of you, I saw you at 80, still beautiful." Sometimes Peter would take my hand and say, "No matter what happens, I won't leave you. Whatever happens, you'll turn around, and I'll be there." Words that, at the time, made me feel like the happiest woman in the world. Today, they ache like rusty knives. I remember once we argued over a trifle. I had forgotten his favorite jacket at the dry cleaners. He was angry but came home with a new one and said, "Losing things just means there's room for something better." That sentence stuck with me. Years later, I would understand it from a different, much darker perspective. He was never violent, never raised his voice, but there was something in his gaze when he was annoyed that made you wish you hadn't made that mistake. In the early days, however, this side of him rarely showed. He was an attentive man, kind to neighbors, helpful. He helped fix pipes, change light bulbs, trim trees. Everyone liked him, everyone admired him. Sometimes I felt like I was in a novel, like the wife of the perfect man. Grace grew up in this loving environment. She never witnessed an argument. He read her stories before bed. On Saturdays, he cooked with her, and when she turned 15, he built her an entire library just for her favorite novels. I watched him with a mix of pride and gratitude. How could I be so lucky? We took few, but intense trips. Peter didn't like leaving the house alone. He said the walls whisper when we're not there, and he'd rather listen to them all the time. That's why we always spent our vacations nearby, a cabin in the woods, a remote mountain lodge, a riverside inn, always with his camera around his neck to capture moments that he would then print and paste into an album titled Our Timeline. There was something hypnotic about the way he made you feel unique. He wrote me letters, even when he didn't have to. Why did he leave me post-it notes on the fridge? Today I dreamed we got married again. Yes, again. Or he'd give me little things for no reason. A wildflower, an old book, a music box with our song. He always said, grand gestures are for people who can't handle the everyday. And he handled it. At least, I thought so. Even our arguments seemed choreographed. They never lasted long. He knew when to apologize, when to be silent, and when to hug me. He had the gift of calming a storm with a whisper. I was in love and I yielded. I thought that's what love was, that our relationship was real, that we would overcome anything. How naive. Mom always said that in true love, you feel at home, even when lost. And with Peter, I always felt at home. That's why his disappearance shattered me so much, because he didn't just take his clothes and his photos, he took my foundation, my emotional roadmap. My compass took my idea of the future. And yet, in those first years, I never could have imagined anything breaking. If someone had told me that this man, who wrote me letters, drank coffee with me, and laughed, could leave me without a word, I would have called them crazy, because Peter looked at me as if I were his salvation. He told me that without me, he would be nobody, that he would travel the whole world to find me if he ever lost me. Words, promises that I now know were empty words, but then they were my truth, my shield, my refuge. We lived a beautiful lie, and I was the happy leading actress in a play that he had begun to dismantle long before I noticed. I can't say there was a specific day when everything began to change. What happened between us was more of a slow erosion, almost imperceptible at first, like those walls that stand firm until one day, at a mere touch, they collapse. That's how it was with Peter. That's how it was with our love. The first signs were subtle. Small gestures that used to be automatic began to disappear. Coffee no longer appeared on the nightstand every morning. Sometimes he said he was running late. Sometimes he didn't even mention it. I didn't complain, at least not immediately. I told myself it was normal, that routines could loosen after so many years, that it was just fatigue, nothing more. Then came the silence, not the pleasant silence of before, which we had enjoyed on rainy Sundays, but a dense, heavy silence, as if words were exhausted, as if his presence no longer needed translation. Peter stopped reading the newspaper aloud. He locked himself in his study for hours. He said he was working, but he wouldn't let me in. This room used to be our refuge for ideas. Now it was a wall. Sometimes, when I talked to him, I felt as if he heard me from a distance, as if I were behind a pane of glass and my words barely reached him. What did you say, Megan? He often repeated, even when what I had said was clear. It was as if he needed to buy time to formulate an answer, as if my voice were foreign to him. I began to notice his absences. First, they were short outings, then he came home later in the evenings, not always with convincing explanations. Met Walter. I was at the hardware store. I was delayed at the workshop, but something about his tone didn't fit. The enthusiasm for telling details was gone. There were only short sentences. One day, I saw him looking at his phone with an expression I didn't recognize. It wasn't worry or urgency. It was something else, as if someone on the other side of the screen was offering him another life. When I approached, he quickly put it away. He smiled at me, but his eyes didn't. That was the first time I felt a coldness that didn't come from winter. I saw him walk through the house from behind, and he seemed like a stranger to me. His movements were tenser, his shoulders more slumped, his clothes more neutral. He no longer asked me to choose his shirts and no longer showed me the photos he had taken with his camera. In fact, the camera had disappeared. He told me it was broken. He never replaced it. Grace also noticed something. One afternoon, she asked me why Dad no longer cooked with her. That hurt me more than anything else, because if Peter was drifting away from me, that made some sense. But drifting away from his daughter, that was something else. I just told her he was busy, that adults sometimes get tired. She nodded silently with her youthful eyes, but I understood she had a suspicion. Children perceive more than we say, and Grace had always been very intuitive. I started watching him more closely and noticed how he avoided physical contact. He no longer brushed against me when he passed behind me in the kitchen. He no longer held my hand in bed and didn't even kiss me when he left. Sometimes he just opened the door. He said he'd be right back and then disappeared for hours. Once I asked him where he was going. He said he needed air. He didn't feel comfortable at home. And then, as if unaware of the impact of his words, he left. The letters stopped. The tray where we always left messages for each other became just another piece of furniture. Weeks passed, then months.
No message, no sentence, just emptiness.
I wanted to write to him. I considered leaving him a letter asking what was wrong. But something inside me held me back. It was as if by saying the words, I would seal the verdict, as if by saying what's wrong with us? I would admit that there was no us anymore. His cologne changed. It was no longer the woody scent that enveloped me in the mornings. Now it smelled stronger, more intrusive, more artificial, as if trying to cover something up. And with this new cologne came a new body language. He avoided my gaze. He became nervous when I approached him. His phone was always muted, face down, and had a code it didn't have before. One night, while he was asleep, I got up and watched him. His face was calm, but his expression was no longer familiar to me. Who was this man in my bed? When had he left, without moving from the spot? I thought about waking him up and telling him, "Come back, find me again." But I didn't. I quietly lay back down and clung to my emptiness. The excuses became increasingly absurd. One day he said he had to travel for business. He had never traveled alone before. I offered to go with him. He said it wasn't necessary, it was only for a few days. He came back with a new shirt I'd never seen before, with a stain on the collar I couldn't identify. I asked him if he'd had fun. He said it was no pleasure and locked himself in the bathroom. I started talking to my friends. Diane, my confidant, looked at me sympathetically when I told her I found Peter distant. "Maybe he's having a crisis, Megan. Men easily get lost when they don't know what they want," she said. But something in her tone sounded warning, as if she knew it too, without telling me. One evening, while tidying his desk drawers, I found a napkin with handwriting that wasn't his. It only said, "Thanks for last night. Again soon." My hands trembled. I said nothing to him. I kept it to myself, in my gut, in my silence. I didn't want to confront him. I didn't want to know, because I knew that if I opened that door, there would be no turning back. I preferred to live in the uncertainty of suspicion than in the certainty of betrayal. But love, when it rots, stinks. And I could no longer ignore the stench. Our house became a shell. Grace went out more. I sought refuge in my books, in my garden, in my routine, and he in his invisible world. Sometimes, when our gazes met, I felt as if he wanted to tell me something, but he never did. Or maybe it was I who still wanted to see some humanity in him. I waited many nights for him with dinner. Sometimes he didn't come, sometimes he came late, ate in silence, and went to bed without saying goodnight. It was habit that embraced me, not love. It was hope that kept me going, not truth. And every time I saw him leave, I felt a part of me die a little more. That's how my marriage began to crumble. Not with shouts, not with violence, but with the cruelest indifference. The indifference of someone who no longer sees you, even though they are right in front of you. The indifference of someone who has already decided to leave but hasn't yet found the perfect excuse for it. And I stayed there, hoping that in a corner of the house we had built together, there was still a spark, a gesture, a word that would tell me, "Megan, I'm lost, but I want to come back." It never came, and deep down, I knew it never would. I was never a woman who reacted dramatically. From a young age, I learned to solve things calmly, logically, and with that quiet determination that is often the only means we women have not to fall apart. But there are moments in life when even the strictest self-control cannot protect us from pain. The day Peter humiliated me was like an open tear in my chest. A wound I never asked for, which exposed me before everyone and myself. It was a Saturday. Our daughter, Grace, turned 18. We had prepared everything for weeks. She wanted something simple but special. An afternoon at home with her closest friends, family, a light dinner, and soft music. I took care of every detail, the snacks she liked, the photos we chose together to hang.
In the garden, lights hung like teeny stars over the tables.
Diane helped me with everything, and although my heart was restless, I forced myself to focus on the moment. It was a day for Grace, not for my doubts, not for my fears, but for her. Peter did not participate in the preparations, asked no questions, offered no opinion, did not help. He only said in a cutting voice, "I'll be there," as if his presence were a burden, as if attending his own daughter's birthday was a favor. I waited for him all afternoon. As we welcomed guests, I kept checking the clock.
6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, noting.
Grace gave me furtive glances, trying to hide her disappointment. "He's probably just running late, Mom. He must be busy with something."
I smiled at her.
I lied to protect her, to protect us. At 9 o'clock, he arrived in a shirt I'd never seen, perfumed with that intrusive scent that meant nothing to me anymore. He hadn't brought a gift, no flowers, no card, nothing. He just walked in. He greeted a few people coolly and poured himself a glass of wine. He didn't even look for Grace. It was she who shyly approached him with a forced smile.
"Dad, I took you weren't coming."
He replied with a kiss on her cheek, without looking into her eyes. He said, "I wouldn't miss it," but his body language spoke a different truth. His posture, his indifference, his distance. They screamed that he didn't want to be there. During dinner, he sat far away from us with some distant cousins, with people he barely spoke to. I watched him from the other end of the garden, surrounded by Grace's friends, faking a calm that tore me apart inside. Diane noticed my tension. She touched my hand with a look that needed no words. "I'm here," her eyes said. I clung to that. Then it was time for the cake. Everyone gathered. The lights dimmed, there was laughter. Grace asked the three of us to come together to blow out the candles. She came to me, took my hand, then looked at her father.
"Are you coming?"
Peter hesitated. He literally hesitated, as if he didn't know whether to join. Finally he came closer, but without enthusiasm. We stood in front of the cake, and as everyone began to sing, he pulled out his phone. In that moment, which was so much ours, so intimate, which our daughter had waited for so long, he turned away, took a call and walked off. The silence was brutal, voices faded within seconds. Grace watched him, tears welling in her eyes. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Everyone looked at us, family, friends. I didn't know where to hide. I took my daughter's hand and said to her, "Blow, darling, do it for yourself." She did. Silently. The smoke from the candles mingled with her disappointment. When he returned 10 minutes later, he didn't apologize, but just said, "It was important." I walked up to him, not angry, but with a dignity that cost me every muscle in my body. "Was it more important than your daughter?" I asked softly. He looked at me with his usual coldness and said, "Don't start now. Don't ruin the evening." The evening was already ruined by him, by his absence, even though he was present. Diane came to me and hugged me without saying anything. "You don't have to put up with this, Megan," she whispered to me, but I no longer knew if I had the strength not to put up with it, because sometimes resistance is all that remains when everything else crumbles. Peter left early. He said he was tired. He didn't wait for the toast, not for the photos, not for the moment Grace unwrapped her gifts. I watched him get into the car and disappear into the night. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back, that something inside me had died. It wasn't sadness, it was something deeper. It was grief for a love that no longer existed. This was the first time I felt ashamed, not for myself, but for him, for what he had become, for the hollow shell that occupied a meaningless space. And at the same time, I knew that I no longer needed him, that if he had decided to leave, even if he still lived under the same roof, I could also decide to move on. That evening, after everyone had left, I cleared away the remnants of the party alone. Grace locked herself in her room. She didn't cry, at least not in front of me, but I know she did. I knew it by how she avoided the topic the next day, how she escaped into her music, her books, her headphones, just as I escaped into silence. I put away the dishes, turned off the lights, and sat in the darkness of the dining room. I looked at the empty chair where Peter should have been and, for the first time, wished he wouldn't come back. I don't know how long I sat there. I only remember that when I stood up, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront him, wouldn't ask for explanations, wouldn't beg for love, because I had understood that begging for love is the cruelest form of humiliation. You don't beg for love, you feel it or you don't, and he no longer felt it. The following days were a test of patience. We shared the house like two strangers. He got up early and left without saying goodbye. I missed him. We barely met in the hallway. We didn't argue, we didn't talk. We weren't. Grace also retreated into her own world. It hurt me to see her like that, but I knew I couldn't force a healing that hadn't yet arrived. Silence connected us, a silence full of questions no one dared to ask. One afternoon, Diane came with a bottle of wine. "I didn't come to talk about him," she said as she walked in. "I came to talk about you." I cried for the first time in weeks. I cried like a little girl, like a broken woman. And in those tears, I found some relief, because when the body can't take it anymore, it cries where it can. From that day on, something began to stir inside me. It wasn't strength yet, just a whisper, a distant voice telling me, "Megan, you haven't lost yourself. You've just waited too long." And she was right. I had waited years for Peter, but not anymore. The humiliation wasn't the reason, nor was his emotional absence. It was his contempt in front of everyone, his public indifference. And that couldn't be forgiven, because he didn't just break me, but also his daughter. And that was unforgivable. From that evening on, I began to write. Not letters to him, not diaries. I wrote down individual thoughts, sentences that gave me stability. They reminded me that I still existed, that I could rebuild myself. Diane encouraged me to continue. She gave me a notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "Your story doesn't end here." And no, it didn't end here. It was just beginning to awaken. I don't know if it was a morning like any other, because when memories mix with trauma, everything is distorted. But I still vividly remember the silence, that dense, oppressive silence, as if the house already knew before I did what was about to happen. I woke up early as always. I put water on for my morning tea, opened the kitchen window, and looked at the same garden we had tended together years ago. The wind moved the curtains with a gentleness that contrasted with the trembling in my chest. Something was wrong. Peter wasn't in bed. I thought he had gone for a run, as he sometimes did. But his running shoes were still next to the door. His car keys weren't there either, nor his phone, his watch, or his wallet. I went up to the attic, then down to the laundry room. Nothing. I called his name, not like someone searching, but like someone begging for an answer, but no one replied. There was no message, no explanation, just absence. That raw absence that leaves no room for doubt. Because when someone deliberately disappears, they leave a void that has a shape. And I felt that shape precisely, cruel, cold. He had left without saying goodbye, without looking back. In the first few minutes, I didn't react.
I stod in the middle of the hallway, my hands trembling, my soul shattered.
My first thought was that something terrible must have happened to him. I called his work, he hadn't shown up. I called his brother, he knew nothing. His mother didn't either. I searched the drawers. Documents were missing. His passport, some papers. Such intense fear overcame me that I literally fell to my knees, as if my body could no longer support me. I called Diane. It took her 7 minutes to arrive. She found me sitting on the floor, hugging myself. "He's gone," I told her. "Are you sure?" She asked with that voice that already suspected the truth. "He left nothing. His passport isn't there. His clothes aren't either. Nothing. He's gone." She hugged me, held me tight, helped me up, and then I started to cry. But they weren't tears of sadness. It was something more primitive. It was despair. It was anger. It was the certainty that I had been abandoned. The following hours were a whirlwind. I went to the police and filed a report. "Voluntary disappearance," they said. "He'll surely come back in a few days."
No, irraplia.
He won't come back. No one understood why there was no turning back. When someone leaves like that, there is no doubt. He left because he wanted to, because he planned it, because he didn't care about anything he left behind. Grace came home that afternoon. She arrived from college. I saw her walk in with her backpack, her headphones, and her sad smile. I made her some tea.
I sat opposite her.
I didn't know how to tell her. There was no gentle way to say it. There was no way to sweeten that wound, so I got straight to the point. Your father has left. She blinked, confused. What do you mean, left? She looked at me, hoping I'd say it was a joke, an exaggeration. He disappeared this morning. He's gone. He didn't leave a message. Her face changed, the expression of a wounded girl, a broken young woman. Why? She asked, barely audible. I didn't know what to answer her. Because he couldn't stay, I said, because he didn't have the courage to face what he had destroyed. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She just locked herself in her room, and that indifference hurt more than any tear. That night I didn't sleep. I walked through the house like a lost soul. I looked at his photos, his coffee cup, his side of the closet. Everything was still there, and at the same time, nothing was there. I called acquaintances, friends, former colleagues. No one knew anything, at least that's what they said. I started driving myself crazy. I thought about checking security cameras. I considered hiring someone, but I held back. What would I find? A truth I didn't want to know. Days passed, then weeks, and he was reported as a voluntary disappearance. The case was closed without further incident. Some people whispered. Maybe he had another family, maybe he was involved in something strange. Maybe he had to start over. I heard everything but said nothing, because deep down, I already knew the answer. There was no secret, only cowardice. Peter hadn't disappeared. Peter had run away, and yet I couldn't stop looking for him. I became addicted to forums, to groups of people searching for missing persons, to news about people who had abandoned their lives. I searched for patterns, clues, names. During one of these searches, I found something, a car similar to his scene in another state. A toll camera had captured it. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it was enough for me to confirm that he was alive, that he had simply walked away. Diane warned me, don't drive yourself crazy. You won't find peace in an explanation, only within yourself. But I needed to understand not for him, but for me, because unexplained abandonment is a form of torture, and I had already endured enough. Grace also began to change. She became more reserved, outwardly stronger, but I knew her. I knew that beneath that protective shell hid a broken child. Sometimes I heard her crying at night. She didn't say anything. I just sat silently outside her door, keeping vigil with my love. 3 months passed, then 6, then a year. Life, they say, goes on, but that's not true. Life drags on when the soul is wounded. Nevertheless, I began to rebuild routines. I went back to the community center. I did crafts, took yoga classes with Diane. I started walking alone, changed the curtains, painted the living room wall, replaced the lock. Because even if I didn't say it aloud, deep down I feared that one day he would come back without warning, and I didn't want that door to ever open for him again. The neighbors stopped asking. The family stopped calling him. It was as if Peter had vanished into thin air, but I felt him in every corner, in every silence, in every question no one asked. One afternoon, while tidying a cabinet, I found an old letter he had written to me years ago, when we had been married for 20 years. It said, I could never leave without you. You are my root. How easy it is to lie with poetry. How cruel it is to turn promises into knives. I kept this letter not as a memory, but as proof that love, when not nurtured, becomes ruin. I never spoke of him again, not to Grace, not to others, but in my dreams his face appeared. Not with tenderness, but with emptiness, like a ghost of what once was, like a reminder that even the deepest love can disappear without a trace. Until one day, a package appeared on my doorstep, no sender, small, wrapped in brown paper, light, no markings, no clues. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was only one thing, an old photograph. The 3 of us, Peter, Grace, and I, in the park when she was 5 years old. I still had long hair. He had that smile I loved so much. And on the back of the photo was a note in his unmistakable handwriting. I'm home. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't fear, it was something deeper, as if time was contracting, as if everything I had buried was suddenly resurfacing. Diane came that afternoon. I showed her the box. What are you going to do? She asked me. I didn't know what to tell her, because for the first time in a long time, I didn't know if I wanted to know the truth. I only knew that something had been set in motion again. An open wound, a cycle that had never closed and was perhaps on the verge of erupting. I sat for hours with the box on the dining table, staring at it as if it were a cursed artifact. I didn't know whether to touch it again, hide it, or burn it. I got up, walked around the house, sat down again, opened the lid, closed it again, looking at the photo repeatedly, as if I could discover something new in it. But no, it was the same picture as always. The three of us smiling on a park bench. The sun shining on our faces. Grace radiating innocence. Peter had his arm around my shoulder. A frozen scene from a time that no longer existed. And behind it, that sentence, those 4 words that kept running through my mind. I'm home. What did it mean? That he had come back, that he was watching me, that he had stood at this door and delivered the package with his own hands? I got up and went straight to the front door. I opened it with a bang and looked around. Nothing. The street was empty. No one was watching. No one moved. It was as if the world had stood still at the exact moment the package appeared.
I called Diane again.
I didn't care that I was interrupting her again. She came, as always, without a word. She found me barefoot in the hallway, trembling. I handed her the box as if it were proof that I had lost my mind. Are you sure that's his handwriting? She asked me, more insistently than ever. That flowing eye, that emphasis on estoy I am. He even used the blue ink he liked so much. It's him. Diane sat down with me. We stared at the box for minutes. She held my hand. She said nothing more. It wasn't necessary. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked through the whole house, turning lights on and off, opening curtains, checking door locks. Something had awakened in me. It wasn't just fear, it was a warning, a presence. I felt he was near, that he had never truly left. At dawn, I made a decision. I went to the basement. The basement had been one of Peter's favorite places. That's where he kept his tools, his old papers, his projects, as he called them. I hadn't been there in years. I went down the wooden stairs with a flashlight in hand, because the light bulbs no longer worked. The air smelled of damp and dust, and every floorboard creaked as if complaining about my presence. There, among boxes and cobwebs, I found something, a chest locked with a padlock. I had never seen it before, or maybe it had always been there and I had just overlooked it. The lock was rusted but still firm. I went to the garage, got a pair of bolt cutters, and broke it open. When I opened the chest, the sight froze me. Folders, photos, documents, letters, all sorted as if in a secret archive. There was a passport in the name of Arthur Peterson with Peter's photo, a driver's license with another name, Kyle Miller. There were even bank accounts in other countries, receipts, transaction records, all detailed neat, as if he had been planning his disappearance for years. But the most disturbing thing was not that, but an unstamped letter signed by his own hand. It said, "If you found this, it's because I couldn't come back for it. Don't hate me." Nothing I experienced was a lie, but it wasn't entirely the truth either. I was many things before I became your husband, Peter, and some of those things still haunt me. What you got from me was real, but who I was not.
Forgive ML for everything.
I read this letter again and again until tears blurred my vision. What did it mean? What was he involved in? Who was this man I had spent more than 20 years of my life with? I went back upstairs and retrieved all the documents. Grace saw me and turned pale. "What is this, Mom?" "It's the truth," I said, "or at least part of it." We spent the afternoon going through the documents. We found movements in foreign accounts, names of cities we had never visited, a photo of a child we didn't know, and then an old postcard with a handwritten date from 1975 on the back.
You always kne how to disappear.
There was no signature, but a terrifying detail, the drawing of a house, our house, as it was before the renovation. I felt watched, I felt betrayed again, as if our entire marriage had been just a facade, a performance. Who else knew who he was in contact with? That night, something changed in me. I was no longer afraid. I was angry, determined. I needed answers and no longer expected them from him. I went back to the box, searched under it, checked the folds, and found something, a small piece of paper hidden between the box and the wrapping paper. It was a hand-drawn map showing a place on the outskirts of town. An old abandoned barn near the creek where we often used to walk years ago. The spot was marked with a red cross, and next to it, in small letters, it said, "What I couldn't tell you is there." The next day, I got ready to go. I didn't tell anyone, neither Grace nor Diane. I took the flashlight, a change of clothes, the map, and drove off. The barn was overgrown with weeds, old, rusted, and secured with a flimsy chain. I broke it with a crowbar I found in the trunk. Inside, it smelled of confinement and decay, and there on a wooden table was another box, similar to the first, only larger. I opened it. Inside was a folder, and in that folder, evidence, photos of armed men, transfer receipts, sealed documents, and something else. A cooperation agreement with a federal agency. Peter had been an informant or a spy or something in between. The story these papers told was of double identity, infiltration, escape. I didn't understand everything, but the essence was clear. He had led a double life. Something had forced him to disappear, something dangerous, something dirty. And in the middle of it all, there we were. I sat on the floor, not crying, not screaming, just breathing, because suddenly everything fit together. The lies, the absences, the mysterious sentences, his disappearance, his silence, the gift, the note. He hadn't just left, he had been hiding. He had used us to protect something or someone. I packed everything up, went outside, closed the door, and as I walked to the car, I felt something. I don't know if it was relief or anger, but I knew this story wasn't over yet. He had led me on purpose. He left clues. He wanted me to know, to reach this truth. Why now? What had made him reappear after so many years? When I got home, Grace was waiting for me on the porch. Where were you? Looking for answers. And did you find them? Some, others are yet to come. She didn't press further, just hugged me. And in that silent gesture, I understood that I was no longer the same woman who had been abandoned. I was now a different woman, one who knew more, one who no longer waited, one who, though still trembling inside, had regained control of her story. As I lay down that evening, I looked at the photo that had been in the first box again. I noticed something new, something I hadn't seen before. On the bench behind us, there was a shadow, a blurred, indistinct figure, a man looking directly at the camera. And for the first time, I knew that on that day, someone else had been there with us. Someone we had never noticed. Someone who might still be standing there, watching, waiting. That night, and the following night, I couldn't sleep. The discovery in that shed had been like opening a door that had been locked for years. Now all the decay, all the truth that Peter had so carefully buried, was coming to light. And it was no longer just about me or our story. It was about Grace, about our safety, about our whole life, which for years had been built on a carefully maintained lie. The next morning, while Grace quietly ate breakfast, I decided that I could no longer protect her with my silence. She had a right to know what her father had done. She had a right to understand why her childhood had been marked by an inexplicable disappearance. I sat opposite her, the folder in my hands. "I need to show you something," I said without preamble. She opened her eyes attentively and nodded. I spread the documents on the table, the passports, the false names, the photos, the cooperation agreement. Grace looked at them one by one, without blinking, as if each page stole a little more of her breath. When I finished, I dared to look up. "Your father wasn't who he pretended to be," I told her. "And what he did to us wasn't just emotional betrayal, it was an escape." She reacted slowly, stood up, walked across the room, and stopped in front of the window. "Why did you never tell me there was a possibility he was still alive?" "Because until now, there wasn't. He made sure we believed the opposite." She sat back down. With trembling hands, she picked up one of the photos. It showed Peter with another woman and a child. "Who are they?" she whispered. "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but I will find out." That was the turning point, the moment I decided to get to the bottom of it. It was no longer enough to discover individual fragments. I had to put the whole puzzle together. I wanted to know who Peter had been before he became my husband, what had driven him to lead a double life, and why he had suddenly decided to leave clues to his whereabouts. It wasn't guilt, it was a warning. I hired a private investigator. I gave him all the material and asked for absolute discretion. In the meantime, Diane helped me organize the documents chronologically. We found that in the 90s, Peter had traveled through Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Colorado, leaving a faint but visible trail in each state. Bank accounts, hotel receipts, even a traffic violation in San Antonio under the name Ethan Reed. Diane was the first to say it aloud. "This isn't an ordinary man fleeing a boring life. This is a network, an operation. And if he's involved in it, then he's still in danger. And so are you." The investigator called me a week later. He had information. We met in an inconspicuous coffee shop downtown. He was a slender man with sharp features and a piercing gaze. He showed me a series of current documents. He had traced one of the accounts still under the name Arthur Peterson. Just under 3 weeks ago, a transfer had arrived from Miami. "Do you think he's there?" I asked. "Not only that," he said. "I found a property in his name, a small apartment in South Beach. And according to the building's doorman, someone matching his description regularly comes and goes there. Always alone, always at different times, but he never lets visitors in." My heart began to pound violently. Peter was not only alive, he was nearby and watching me. He had allowed me to find him. I asked the investigator for the exact address. He wrote it down on a piece of paper for me. I folded it and put it in my handbag. I told no one, not even Diane. That night, I packed a small suitcase, left a note for Grace, and took the first bus to Miami. The journey was long, 16 hours full of confused thoughts, memories mixed with theories, images that tormented me. What hurt me most wasn't that I had been betrayed, but that I had loved a man who had never existed. I arrived at the building at dawn. It was modern, inconspicuous, raising no suspicion. I sat on a bench outside the entrance, covered myself with a scarf, put on sunglasses, and pretended to be any woman waiting for a taxi. Hours passed. People came and went, couples, elderly people, a delivery driver. And then I saw him. His hair was whiter, he was thinner, but it was him. Peter walked with firm steps, but looked everywhere. In one hand, he carried a bag of bread. He went inside without looking back. My legs trembled. I couldn't move. I should have gone closer, called his name, but I didn't. No, I wanted to see more, no more. I waited until he came out again. At noon, he came out again. This time, I followed him. I saw him go into a small coffee shop. He sat alone, ordered a coffee, took out a notebook, and began to write. He constantly looked around, as if expecting someone to recognize him. I didn't approach him, not yet. I came back the next day, and the day after that too. For 3 days, I followed him silently, observed him, and memorized his movements. I had to be sure. I had to be prepared. And then I confronted him. It was in the park, on a bench under the trees. On the 4th day, I sat next to him without saying anything. He turned his head, looked at me, and said no word, no surprise, no guilt, no joy. He just looked at me as if he had been waiting for me. "Hello, Peter," I said. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes. "I knew you'd come," he whispered. Endless seconds passed during which I didn't know whether to hug him, slap him, or just run away. "Why?" I asked. "Because I couldn't stay, because it was either that or dragging you down with me." "And Grace? I thought you'd be better off without me." "It hurts me every day," he said. "There's no night I don't think of your face. There's no moment I don't think of what I lost." "You lost nothing, Peter. You destroyed it with your decisions, with your silence." He handed me a folder, more papers, more confessions, this time signed. It was his full testimony about covert operations in the 90s, about cooperation with governments, about escape, threats, betrayal from within his own ranks. He had reported everything and was awaiting trial under discreet protection and with a protected identity.
And now?
I asked. Now you decide if you'll turn me in, if you'll report me, if you'll make me disappear again. I have no strength left. I'm not running anymore. I stood up without replying. I looked at him one last time and walked away. He didn't stop me, didn't call me. He just stood there, staring at the ground. I returned home with a shattered soul, but also with something else, with peace. I had faced the ghost. I had looked at the man who had broken me, and I was still alive and stronger than ever. I took the folder to a lawyer. We began the formalities. His statement would now be legally valid, and his identity no longer a secret. But I had uncovered the most important thing. I had stripped the mask from the man who had ruined me, and in doing so, I had rebuilt myself. Returning home wasn't easy. Not after seeing him, not after confirming with my own eyes that Peter was alive, that he breathed the same air as me, that he walked the same streets, while I had spent the last 18 years wondering when I had lost him. But the worst wasn't that. The worst was that, despite all the truth before me, I felt no relief, only a deep emptiness, a mix of sadness, disappointment, and, strange as it may sound, pity. Peter wasn't the monster I had imagined for so many years. He also wasn't the man I had once loved. He was a shadow, a broken figure, shattered by his own choices, a man who had chosen flight as a way of life. But I hadn't. I had stayed. I had faced the pain day after day, and now I would also face rebuilding. The first decision I made was symbolic. I had all the locks on the doors changed. Not because I was afraid Peter would come back, but because I felt I needed to protect my space. The house we had once built together no longer belonged to him, but to me. Every object, every corner, every photo, everything passed through my filter, my story, and that had to be reflected even in the small things. Then I spoke with Grace. It was a long, painful, but absolutely necessary conversation. I told her every detail of the encounter, every word, every pause. She listened with reddened eyes, bit her lip, and nodded slowly. "And what do we do with him now?" she asked me. "Nothing," I replied. "He has no power over us anymore. We don't have to do anything." That didn't mean, however, that I wouldn't take action. In the following days, I handed over all the documents, testimonies, photos, and copies of Peter's confessions. I also initiated legal proceedings to sever all legal and financial ties between us. No traces should remain, no joint accounts, no shared property, no inheritance rights. Diane, loyal as ever, accompanied me every step of the way. She was my silent witness, my protective shadow. "You've been reborn, Megan," she told me one afternoon as we drank tea in the garden. "But you did it your way, without scandals, without shouting, as only strong women can." And she was right. For the first time in my life, I felt light, without guilt, without invisible chains. The rebuilding process was not only legal and material but also internal, emotional, and spiritual. I resumed painting classes and began writing in my notebook again. I went for morning walks, greeted neighbors, and rediscovered the streets of my neighborhood as if they were new to me. Every day was a small victory, every night, one less sigh.
One day, I found a letter in the mailbox.
It had no sender, just the words, "Forgive everything. I'm ready to truly disappear if that brings you peace." I read it only once, then tore it into 1,000 pieces and threw them from the balcony into the wind. I needed no words. I needed no explanations. I only needed silence, and it finally returned. A few weeks later, the first news broke. A former federal agent, who had lived under a false identity for years, surrendered to authorities with evidence of an international corruption network. His name didn't make the front pages, but I knew who he was. I offered no comments, no interviews, sought no attention, I just observed. And while the world discovered a truth I already knew, I continued to build my own. Grace started therapy. For the first time, she spoke openly about the abandonment, the pain, the nights of her childhood spent waiting for an answer that never came. Her process was different from mine, but just as brave. She wasn't seeking justice. She was seeking meaning, and she found it little by little. One afternoon, she came to me with an envelope in her hand. She opened it in front of me. It was a document. She had changed her last name. She was no longer Grace Peterson, but Grace Miller. My last name, my lineage, our story. We cried together in silence, because we knew something was complete, that one chapter was ending, and a new one was beginning. I looked at the old photos again, those from our wedding, our vacations, our birthdays. They no longer hurt as much. They no longer brought tears to my eyes. They were simply memories, frozen images of a life that had existed but no longer defined me. Diane suggested a trip to a small coastal town in Maine where her family had a house. I hesitated, but I agreed. And there by the sea, surrounded by salt and wind, for the first time in years, I felt genuine joy again. I laughed loudly, danced under the stars, walked barefoot in the sand, and understood that rebuilding wasn't just repair, but transformation. I was no longer the woman waiting for answers. I was the woman choosing paths. Back home, I started writing a book, not about Peter, not about his betrayal, but about women like me. Women who had been erased, silenced, pushed aside. Women who quietly stood up every day and kept going. I called it The Woman Who Rewrote Her Story. My story wasn't perfect, but it was my story. And every word written was a way to reclaim lost time, to honor the pain, and to be grateful for resilience. One day, as I was coming back from the farmer's market, a woman passed me and looked intently.
She came closer and touched my arm.
"Are you Megan?" she asked. I nodded, surprised. "Thank you," she said simply, "for speaking out, for showing that you can start anew." I didn't know what to answer. I just smiled. Rebuilding wasn't a destination, it was a process. And in that process, I was neither a victim nor a survivor. I was a whole woman, a woman who had walked through fire and emerged on the other side unafraid. I was never a vindictive woman, but I was a woman who had learned through blows and silence to distinguish between justice and punishment. What had happened to me with Peter could not be undone. There was no way to erase 18 years of uncertainty, abandonment, and emotional scars. But I could do something to prevent his story from repeating, to protect others, and most importantly, to finally close this chapter. The letter he had sent me, which I had torn up without hesitation, was his last attempt to still call the shots. A belated apology was not reparations, much less restitution. It was just a weak gesture, and I no longer responded to weak gestures. The investigations into his true identity, thanks to the documents I provided, the copy of his fake passport, the written confession, the contacts with Beverly, and the photos from his new life, had taken shape in court. The district attorney's office had solid evidence to initiate criminal proceedings for identity fraud, tax evasion, abandonment of household, and an endless list of administrative offenses. But I did not attend any hearings. It wasn't necessary. My lawyer was clear. We could demand financial compensation. I replied without hesitation, "I want him to disappear from my story. I don't want his money. I don't want his name. I just want all this to end with my dignity intact." And so we did. Peter was officially subpoenaed. The news didn't make the front pages, but it found its way into the legal sections of local newspapers.
Another case of double life, fraud, escape.
But for me, it was much more than that. It was the end of the echo. One day, I received an unexpected message. It came from an unknown number. It wasn't Peter, but Beverly, the woman with whom he had built his second life.
"I need to talk to you."
He told me you know everything. He lied to me for years. I could have ignored her, but something in me, I don't know if it was curiosity or the instinct to finally get closure, made me respond. We arranged to meet in a small, inconspicuous coffee shop, far from prying eyes, far from my neighborhood, far from my newfound peace. She arrived before me. She was younger than me, significantly younger, but she wasn't naive. She had dark circles under her eyes. Her face was etched with sleepless nights. Her expression was broken. "I'm kicking him out of the house today," she said without preamble. "I can't live a life built on lies anymore." I nodded. I didn't need to tell her anything else. I knew he had introduced himself as a widower, that his wife had died in an accident. The air caught in my throat, but I didn't react.
Noting kurze Preis ml Animore.
Sometimes I think he really believes his own stories, I said to her, as if repeating it so often that he could no longer distinguish between reality and invention. Beverly lowered her gaze. She held back tears. She didn't cry. Not in front of me. Thank you for telling me the truth. No one else would have. We parted without a hug, without promises, just with the look of two women who had, unwillingly, been part of the same lie. A few days later, the lawyer confirmed to me that Peter had lost all rights to our shared assets. Even his name, legally linked to mine, was erased. There was no more Peter Peterson. He no longer existed in my papers, not in my accounts, not in my photos, not at my door. A final letter arrived. Yes, another one. This time from a detention facility. I know I deserve nothing, but you need to know that I was never happy, neither with you nor without you. Everything was fear. Fear of being myself, fear of disappointing, fear of facing things. Forgive me for being so cowardly. I didn't tear it up, I kept it. Not out of nostalgia, but as a testament, as an emotional piece of evidence. Grace read it. She looked at me with hard eyes. And what will you do with it? Nothing, I said. This time, I will do nothing. I don't need to answer him. He's sunk himself. Diane hugged me when she heard the story. She said nothing. Sometimes, the deepest friendship is expressed in silence. Weeks passed, the verdict was handed down. The legal consequences hit him without me having to pursue him. I had handed him over to the system so that others would judge him, so that he would have to confront his own reflection. But true justice was different. It was the peace I felt while eating breakfast alone and being able to enjoy it. Reading undisturbed, listening to the wind without being startled, was like Grace reclaiming her last name, her voice, her laughter. It was like walking with Diane again without having to look back, like looking at my reflection and finding myself again. One evening, sitting on the patio, I wrote something in my diary that closed this chapter with permanent ink. I no longer wait for answers. I am no longer afraid of ghosts. I no longer carry guilt that isn't mine. My story finally belongs to me. I received one last call, this time from the police. They informed me that Peter had accepted a plea bargain. Full confession. No appeal. Reduced sentence, community service, mandatory psychological counseling, no incarceration, but supervision. Was that enough? For many, perhaps not, but for me it was, because the true punishment was not the legal penalty, but living with the awareness of having destroyed one's own life with one's own hands. And that chain was much heavier. I hung up without saying a word, closed the notebook, and took a deep breath. Justice, at last. Not with fanfare, not with revenge, but like a gentle breeze cleansing the earth after a storm. I looked up at the sky, asked for nothing, only thanked and promised myself that from this moment on, I would live every day as someone who had regained something irreplaceable, her own name, the tranquility of a home where there are no more secrets, a home where, finally, I am the sole author of my story. Life doesn't always offer neat endings. Sometimes things just vanish, extinguishing like a candle that has no more wax to sustain the flame. But I needed closure, a real, tangible one, not for him. For me. Months passed since the last contact with the justice system. Peter served his sentence in the shadow of anonymity, performing community service at a rehabilitation center for homeless men. Ironic, I thought, finally he stood man to man with men who, like him, had lost their place in the world through their own choices. I never learned if he got his life back on track. It didn't concern me. I, on the other hand, began to write, to fill pages with things I had never said. Words I had swallowed for decades, not to publish them, but just to release everything that burdened me. Writing healed me. One afternoon, while tidying the attic, I found an old box, the kind you keep mementos in, letters from my mother, drawings from Grace, and underneath, an old yellowed unopened envelope. It wasn't dated, but sealed with his handwriting. I recognized it immediately. It was from Peter. He must have left it there before he disappeared. Perhaps it was a last attempt to give me an explanation or a farewell that, for some reason, I had never seen until now. I hesitated to open it, but I did. Inside it read, Megan, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer here. Or what I was, no longer exists. I don't know how to ask for your forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. I left because I was a coward, because I couldn't face the life we had built, because I felt small compared to everything you are. It was never a lack of love, it was my own failure. Before I left, there was a moment when I wanted to confess everything to you, but I saw you sleeping, frowning, as if you already knew, and I couldn't. I hate myself for not being better. I hate myself for dragging you into a story you didn't know was broken until it shattered in your hands. You deserve peace, you deserve love, you deserve a whole life, not half measures. If one day you can forgive me, I will know God exists. If you don't, I will understand. Peter. I read it once, then again, then again. I didn't cry, I had no tears left. I took the envelope, went into the garden, and lit a small fire in the fire pit Diane had given me, the same one where we had roasted chestnuts in winter. I threw the letter in and watched the words twist in flames, disintegrating letter by letter, just as our story had disintegrated. Slowly, silently, without screams. Grace watched me from the window. She said nothing, asked nothing. She already knew. Since then, life was different. No more letters without a sender, no more ghosts, just coffee in the morning with freshly baked bread and open books. Diane and I took a trip together. We returned to the village where, as teenagers, we had jokingly sworn we'd spend our golden years. And we kept our promise. We rented a small house by the lake. We painted the walls in absurd colors. We filled the garden with daisies. We planted a lemon tree. On quiet afternoons, I wrote letters not to him, but to myself, to the Megan I once was. One evening, alone in my room, I lit a candle. I sat in front of the mirror, not to put on makeup or fix my hair, but just to look at myself. I saw the lines on my forehead, the marks around my eyes, the determination in my mouth. I spoke softly to myself. You survived. And I smiled. That was my last letter. The only one that mattered. Not written on paper, but on my skin, in my soul, in the air. Some time later, I received a call from Beverly's daughter, not to talk about him, but to thank me. Thank you for not hitting back. Thank you for administering justice with elegance. I replied that it wasn't courage, but a necessity, because a woman can break. But she can also mend herself with golden threads, like those Japanese ceramics that don't hide their cracks, but celebrate them. My cracks made me strong. My story finally belonged only to me, and if someone ever asks me what became of Peter, I will only say, he left, and I finally came back.